Sure. Welcome to this Financy Masterclass, where we're talking about turning the tables in relation to sexism. So how you can win and avoid losing out. Of course, this relates to your career, but you can apply the strategies and what you get from today's session into everyday life, even into relationships. So joining me today is Professor Shruti Sardeshmukh, and she is the Executive Co-Director of the Center of Enterprise Dynamics in Global Economies. Very impressive title, at the University of South Australia. She is an expert, even though she doesn't want to say she's an expert, but a specialist in enabling entrepreneurship, inclusion, and innovation. She works with a lot of high growth industries in, for example, space and defense. So some very cool people in terms of who she researches. And today we're going to be learning a lot from her when it comes to sexism. Now, this is a really important subject when we talk about economic equality, when we talk about the progress of women, because there are barriers that many women experience that might relate to sexism that can often force us to steer or to pivot to another angle, or to just drop out altogether, or at times we might not want to call things out. But indeed, that has really changed over the past year and a half, I'm glad to say, in relation to calling things out. So let's talk through the issues, the barriers, and then the strategies to making things better and more progressive for women. Now, in general, when we talk about sexism, of course, we tend to think about women, because by and large it is associated there and we see more examples, but that doesn't mean it doesn't also apply to men. It does. What we do tend to see, and Shruti will look at, is that the impacts and disadvantages tend to be longer lasting upon women than they do on men in general. So just before we get into it, most members will tend to watch this on replay, but for those joining us, be respectful, ask questions away about your experience or for those around you, so we can educate as many people as possible. Of course, this event is now being recorded, and an acknowledgement of country. Financy acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples of Australia and traditional custodians of its land, its waters. We pay our respects to elders, knowledge holders, leaders, both past and present, and respectively acknowledge traditional owners whose country Financy's office is located in the Bundjalung Nations. Now let's get into it by introducing you to Professor Sardeshmukh.
All right. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, my name is Shruti Sardeshmukh, and I'm an associate professor in UniSA Business, and I'm also an executive co-director of CEDGE, Center for Enterprise Dynamics in Global Economies. And as Bianca just pointed out, my research is about enabling entrepreneurship and inclusive innovation. So those two are entrepreneurship, innovation, and inclusion is my passion. And that also extends to gender inclusion. Do I share the screen to show my slides now? Sounds good. Oh, I can't share my screen yet. So you may have to give me some powers.
I've given you the power.
Okay, I have the power. Can you see it okay? Yep, perfect. So welcome to the masterclass on turning the tables. This is a masterclass, but what I want to start is a conversation about how all of us, men and women, can effectively employ strategies to combat sexism. So I want to start off by giving you an overview of what today's situation is, what we mean by workplace sexism. We talk about the nature of these challenges faced particularly by men, but as Bianca pointed out, also a little bit by men, but less so. And then finally, we zero in on some of the strategies. We'll talk about how we can do to combat sexism, and for all of us, men and women, to make the world a better place. So just to set the scene, I want to put these screenshots for your eyes. Now, these are from just last couple years. The bigger picture is showing, in terms of tennis, advantage men. I'm not going to talk more about it, but I'm going to leave it on the screen for just a few seconds. Go ahead, Google these headlines whenever you like.
I think you actually sent me the doctor's one.
Yep.
Separately.
All right. Right. If that's sufficiently depressing, let's get on with the next slide. So we are already in the third decade of the 21st century. We have come a really long way since the 1950s. Nearly half the workforce in most developed countries consists of women. So it's about 47% in Australia, about the same, just a little less in America, and so on. So in the workforce, there is this near gender equality. But what happens as soon as you start getting into more other fields, as soon as you start getting into advancing into your career or entrepreneurship and self-employment, the share of women starts shrinking. This gender equality starts melting away as you start advancing. Also, it starts melting away in high-paying STEM-based occupation. When women do enter the labor force or when they're in the workforce, they're more likely to work part-time. They're less likely to work in management roles. They are earning less than women. On an average, in OECD countries, developed countries, there is a 15% gross gender pay gap. And what is sad is that the number has not changed over the last 10 years. So women are less likely to become entrepreneurs. Women owned business, and that's close to my, that's a research very close to my heart. Women-owned businesses tend to make less profits or earn less than male-owned businesses. Self-employed women are less likely to have employees as compared to self-employed men. So their businesses are smaller. They also tend to operate, women tend to operate different types of businesses. For example, 70% more of self-employed women work in services sector as compared to about 50% of men. And in STEM-dominated high-growth entrepreneurship sector, women are a big minority. They are really in minority because they get this double whammy. They have the disadvantage in STEM and also disadvantage in entrepreneurship. Why am I bringing this kind of gender segregation? Because this kind of gender segregation is related to stereotyping. So when women work in these so-called feminine roles and men work in these so-called masculine roles, it actually reinforces the gender stereotypes. And these stereotypes hurt women in their career progression, especially in these high-paying, advanced, and often male-dominated roles. So when you're in these minority situation, you may be at the top in the C-suite and you're such a minority, a couple of things happen. First of all, as a small minority, first you're very acutely aware of the group you belong and where you don't belong. If you are the only woman in a sea of men, you know it. They become suddenly more weirdly visible than men, and their gender became salient. Suddenly, you're not just a manager or a scientist or an entrepreneur. You are a woman scientist or a woman entrepreneur or a woman manager. And that means the performance of these minority women is scrutinized more. They have greater performance pressure. It also means that if there are any differences, these differences get amplified or exaggerated, and it creates a contrast. So especially when women are playing these gender incongruent roles, when they go against the gender stereotype, that's when the sexism hurts, and it hurts a lot. I'm an academic. Anytime you ask an academic, you have to start with a definition. So here's what I mean by sexism. It's the dictionary definition. So sexism spans a broad range of bad behaviors. It can be overt. That includes sexual harassment, domestic violence, discriminatory practices, gender-based bullying, harassment, and all that. And some might think that women are incapable, inferior, weak. We still do see examples of that, but thankfully there are regulations across almost all developed countries. Overt sexism is already recognized as a problem. These overtly sexist practices are no longer accepted in modern society in that kind of a form. And in many cases, they are illegal and are punishable by law. I don't want to go into that overt sexism. What I want to talk about is the other manifestation of sexism. That's a bit more subtle, and that's why a bit more dangerous. That's what I want to focus on here. So this more modern, subtle form of sexism in some ways is more problematic. Because first of all, people think now that sexism is no longer an issue in society, and it's a thing of the past. And once you have that as a premise, once you start believing that, it creates a backlash against women who are fighting for equity and the gender conscious practices. And we just saw evidence two slides ago that, well, there is still a gap. And still the modern sexism denies that gap. And that's where it starts. So there is this denial, a subtle form of sexism. And then, of course, there is a more benevolent form of sexism. It's almost kind and well-intentioned. It comes from the gender stereotypes, and it can hurt women. So there could be a manager not even asking a woman employee about a promotion opportunity because, of course, she won't want to relocate. Her family is here. Or not inviting a woman manager to an evening networking session because, of course, she has to take care of family and won't be able to make it to an evening event. And then, of course, there is that everyday sexism. In a meeting with lunches, a woman may be expected to unwrap the lunches, or a woman may be expected to organize a work birthday party. Of course, there are these little microaggressions, just the little comments that undermine the legitimacy and they make us feel inferior. A simple example, and I was talking to Bianca about it just before we started recording. In a meeting, someone addresses the group as gents, even though there are women clearly in the group. As we talked about, sexism is related to gender stereotypes. And these stereotypes result from and also the reason of these deeply ingrained attitudes and values and norms and prejudices. What I want to point out that these stereotypes are not just held by men, they're held by both men and women. And sometimes they're so ingrained that we don't even realize that we are holding those stereotypes. I want to tell a story, a very funny but telling anecdote. Indra Nooyi, the former head of PepsiCo, told this story. So when Indra Nooyi told her mother that she had been appointed the president of PepsiCo, you know what her mom said? Her mom said, "The news can wait. I need you to go out and get milk. Listen to me. You may be the president or whatever of PepsiCo, but when you come home, you're a wife and a mother and a daughter."
I like that. And that's not sexist, though. Is that sexist?
I think it speaks to the stereotypes. It does speak to the stereotypes in a sense that even though you may have a fantastic career and you're coming home with probably one of the biggest news in corporate history, you have to come back to those gender stereotypical roles.
Yeah. So are we saying, and I get now why you've got this definition up there, it's about defining what sexism is. It's not just being rude sexually or blatantly. It really can be quite subtly about those stereotypes.
Absolutely.
It has people like me saying, that's not sexist, I'm not being sexist. It's, yeah.
And so it's not overt sexism, it's that subtle sexism that creates that unconscious bias, and that can come from both men and women. And that's the dangerous thing, is that's what we need to be aware of. What are the gender stereotypes that we think exist? So there are many ways sexism can manifest itself, especially in these subtle ways. Even these little sexist episodes can affect our career progress. And they can affect women's health and well-being. So we'll talk about some of the examples that came from in our research, but there are many ways we can see the research. And those subtle sexist things or gender stereotypes can affect when women decide whether they want to pursue maths or science or not, whether they want to earn an engineering degree or not, whether they want to work full-time or part-time. And so in some ways, these stereotypes also impact our own decision-making. Most of my research is about entrepreneurship and also in male-dominated industries. And that's where women really experience this stereotype threat. Now, stereotype threat means the fear of being negatively stereotyped and how it affects your performance. A classic example, men are typically viewed as being better at math. Would you agree? At least in Western countries. I never learned that when I grew up in India. I mean, girls and boys did math equally proficiently. And I guess that's the cultural difference. But when your gender is salient and that negative stereotype exists, it affects the performance of those who are negatively stereotyped as such. So it is about that fear of being negatively stereotyped and then confirming that negative stereotype. It is situational. A woman or an ethnically diverse person, when they become a part of that negative stereotype, if they believe others have that negative stereotype, it can actually impair their performance. So it emerges in situation where a person's performance could be explained by a negative stereotype about his or her respective group. And that's the more researchy way of putting it, but it's situational. It is felt only in situation when one is vulnerable to those negative stereotypes about one's group. And many times it's women who are vulnerable to these kind of negative stereotypes. And how does it work? So entrepreneurs are expected to be strong and resolute and risk-taking and all these masculine characteristics, right? They're not supposed to be caring or gentle or yielding or shy. They have to show agency. They have to take action, become more proactive. But the feminine stereotype is to be communal, to be caring. So if you are that only woman in a sea of men in a high growth entrepreneurship situation, how would it affect you?
I have spoken to a lot of CEOs, former CEOs, who were in this same position. And one just recently, it's on the Equalizer podcast, she said that it was like attending an all-boys school and being the only girl in the playground. Mm-hmm. They spoke a language that took her some time to get up to speed with. Mm-hmm. But, you know, on the flip side of that, it would be the same if it was one man in a whole sea of females, wouldn't it?
And you're absolutely right. There are female-dominated, women-dominated profession. Nursing comes to mind. And a few months ago, I facilitated a discussion about these gender incongruent roles. And we had a couple of women who worked in construction, and a man who worked as a designer, and a man who worked as a nurse. And we had some really interesting patterns of stories to hear. So do they experience this strange kind of sexism? To some extent, yes. So the male nurse told this little anecdote where the organization he worked for changed the uniforms. But guess what? They forgot about men's uniforms. And so there were only 2 men. And so because they forgot about their uniforms, they just started wearing Hawaiian shirts, and that became their uniform.
Yeah.
Now, he made humor out of it. He took it in a stride and moved on. But even then, in general, research shows that men actually suffer less from these kind of gender stereotypes, in a sense that when you're working in when a man is working in a women dominated industries, they actually tend to get promoted sooner. They may experience some advantage, and definitely don't experience a disadvantage as a result of their minority status. And that's because the traditional stereotype hold that men are more competent in external work related world, and that may be a reason behind that. It's also how people expect men and women to behave. So it's not just a woman's behavior, but about how society expects you to be. It creates situations that may be different for women to navigate. For example, it could be a woman entrepreneur and a male entrepreneur, man entrepreneur going ahead in asking for funding. Now, asking for funding in entrepreneurship is one of the most important things you can do to grow your venture. But we have research that shows that investors ask men and women entrepreneurs different questions. They ask men questions that focus on the upside, and they ask women questions that focus on preventing the downside. What effect do you think it has on the funding outcomes for these men and women entrepreneurs?
Yeah, that's so interesting. So focusing on the upside, is it that men are more likely to talk up the upside to solicit those kind of questions, or what did your research show with that?
So this is a research by Kanze, and it came. I'm happy to share the citations and the paper. There was also an article in the Harvard Business Review about it.
Mm-hmm.
But the key point was that the men were asked about the upside of the opportunity, so a more positive focus, while women were asked about mitigating the risk, a negative focus.
Yes,
because entrepreneurship is risky, of course, but even the questions they get asked are going to be different.
Yes. So how do you navigate that?
So one thing people recommend is that you have to have a same list of questions for both men and women entrepreneurs. You can't have different types of questions.
And what if you're the entrepreneur?
If you are the entrepreneur, you have to start emphasizing and react to it and make sure you tell your upside story equally well. And it does put extra burden on the women entrepreneurs to make sure they emphasize the upside. So this can actually potentially hurt women entrepreneurs. Right? And what do they try to do? What happens when they try to break those stereotypes? And what do they try to adopt that the more masculine traits? So just today on a Twitter thread, I saw this interesting cartoon, and it said, it's funny describing a cartoon, but the cartoon asked about the difference between assertiveness and aggressiveness. And the person asked, it's the gender.
How did that go down?
I liked it.
Because I'm assuming that assertive is feminine.
Assertive is men. So men, for the same action, men are perceived as assertive while women are perceived as aggressive.
Oh, wow. No, sorry. I got that wrong.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So, yep. So in some ways, and if you were talking about the women CEOs, they're probably in the same bind. So, so if you are very communal, if you are caring, you have all these traditionally feminine traits, then you are criticized because you're not a strong leader, right? But if you do conform to the stereotypes, it hurts you. And then if you break the stereotype and show aggressiveness, you get the backlash because you're bossy or you're not woman enough. So this creates a double bind, and research has documented this kind of a double bind in many studies.
Yes. So if you may be the same level of assertiveness, but you being assertive is aggressive.
Seen negatively. Is seen negatively.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so far, we are just talking about men and women. What happens to those who actually belong to multiple minority groups? So someone with a woman with an ethnic minority background, or women with disability. And I can give you examples of research from America, which shows that African-American women actually experience disadvantages compared to both African-American men and white women. So having this intersectionality actually creates this multiplied disadvantage, and we need to keep that in mind. So when we expand this research and practice to promote inclusion, I want to point out that diversity is multidimensional. Also, all this time that we're talking about, we talked about gender as a binary, and increasingly, gender is considered is not just a binary phenomenon. So if we want to promote inclusion, diversity is indeed multidimensional, and inclusion that I'm interested in has to be more broad. So what happens? All this theory that we talked about, all this research, how does it manifest itself in real life? And this is where I want to, at times, I want to throw it back to you, Bianca and Paula, is if you have experienced any such barriers because of your gender, we can talk. But the picture I have is that of a Mobius strip. A Mobius strip is where there is only one surface. If you run a pencil along it, it doesn't stop. It goes on to both sides. And the reason I want to talk about is because there are systemic challenges and there are cultural challenges. And these systemic and cultural challenges are so closely intertwined. They merge into another. And where they come from is from not being aware of women's challenges and attitudes and perspectives. So part of it is because we're just seen as outsider. When you think about an entrepreneur, what's the image that comes to your mind? Just close your eyes and think about an entrepreneur.
Well, of course, I'm completely biased. I'm thinking of myself.
Right, there you go. I'm glad.
But you know, when I'm driving around town, there's no, like, I just looking at trades, for example, because we're building a house. By and large, are men running their own businesses, and maybe they have some female trades, maybe they have women doing the books, but so by and large, yes, mostly men.
Men. And if you talk about the big names in tech entrepreneurship, it's Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Richard Branson, but nobody thinks about Melanie Perkins. Or even or nobody thinks about Bianca. But the question, and the reason is that the prototypical engineer, prototypical entrepreneur is a man. A prototypical manager becomes a man. A prototypical scientist is a man. A prototypical doctor is a man. A prototypical CEO is a man. And so what happens when you are one of the few women in a sea of white beards at the top? It creates a problem for women because it undermines their professional legitimacy. And I'll give you some examples from research. So entrepreneur who goes into a meeting with a client and she gets asked, did your daddy fund your business?
I wish.
So another geoscientist from our study, from our research, she was told, you don't look like a geoscientist. So you're heading a team of 50 and you're told that you don't belong. How does that make you feel? So this kind of not being a prototype or not being a prototype and that getting highlighted also manifests itself in other ways. So there was a Twitter thread about women doctors, and I followed this fairly carefully. And this doctor talked about how she was using a doctor's computer, and someone said and asked her to get off it because that was for doctors only, because there are plenty of women doctors, and you still get this strange dynamics where you are delegitimized. And when you have this delegitimization, it also comes with devaluation of women's ideas and opinions. There's plenty of research that says that women's ideas are ignored. One study from US that says that when the leadership is not diverse, women are less likely to get their ideas endorsed. That's a waste, because here are your innovative, good quality, innovative ideas just not being considered because someone who came up with them is a woman. There is also research that women get the same amount of innovative ideas, but they just don't get progressed, because gender role stereotypes and expectation affect how they are expressed, including how we express them. So when women have to compete to have our ideas heard, we stop trying to advance our ideas. Why? Because if you're driving your ideas, you're seen as pushy or bossy. Men are supposed to be agentic, not men. No, men are supposed to be agentic, not women. And we know that when women undertake gender role incongruent behavior, they get a backlash. So again, some of these challenges are systemic, but they also comes from these gender norms. The other systemic challenge comes from women's networks. These networks continue to be a disadvantage to us. Women's professional Our networks, our professional networks are less powerful and less effective than women's networks.
So, no, you're saying female networks are less effective than
men's networks.
Men's networks.
Yes, that's especially when it comes to instrumental benefits.
Okay, I need to understand this better before I deselect my whole network.
So there are structural patterns related to women's role that affect, like women's role, like our being a mother or being a caregiver and child rearing, that affects our ability to network professionally. I'll give you an example. So here you are, like in any career journey, the time in your late 20s and 30s is when you're going to ramp up your career. Would you agree? That's also the prime time for childbearing. So that's when you take time off. And if you don't actively do as a person and also as an organization to get people back on track, you can have that disadvantage carried over later on. This is where systemic disadvantage starts appearing. Other example, most of these networking events, even for women leaders and entrepreneurs, all take place in the evening. Now, if you follow the traditional gender roles, women are responsible for family care. So they go home. And then you have this Mobius strip of barriers where the cultural and structural norms kind of blend into each other to create barriers for women in networking. The other thing is that we don't like instrumental networks. We like our networks to be of friends and peers. We connect better with our peers rather than connecting up. We also don't like to ask for one-sided favors. So we don't ask favors, one-sided favors to those who are in positions of power. We would rather do it alone than ask for help and not give back. And that restricts our networks. So if we wanted to network up, that's something that we have to think about.
I understood that a little and not well enough. So I first, and I need to move us on to the strategies to deal with all this. So maybe we get to that at the end. But the big thing I got out of that is, are women's networks detrimental to female progress?
No, it's how we structure our networks. So if we have a women, that's the fact that exists if we structure our networks the way we have done. But we can actually structure our networks differently and not just have women's network. We actually can structure our network more powerfully. And that's where in the next slide, we talk about how more powerful women can help other women.
Okay.
So no, don't just rely on the network of peers, also include more powerful people. And as a powerful woman, you have to mentor and help other women expand, create those support structures. But that's a really good point. It's not just, so think about it this way. If you just have a peer network, men have networks that are, or that cut age that cut across age and hierarchy.
Yes.
So you can have, and these are the networks that can actually help them advance.
Yes. They do seem, my observation, they do seem, I think sport has a huge role to play in that, in the creation of what seems to be longer lasting networks. That for my husband, he just needs to join a local rugby club and suddenly, you know, it's huge, the network collaboration.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So diversifying, broadening our network is definitely a way to go.
Okay, take us to the strategies.
All right. So the first thing is obvious. If you see something, call it out. If you see bad things, whether it happened to you or when you see it happen to someone else, call it out. Don't be a silent victim or a silent bystander. What happens when in a meeting you don't even get introduced? You speak up and make yourself heard. But if you see someone say something sexist, you can ask questions like, what do you mean by that? To challenge that perpetrator. Now, it doesn't have to be a conflict-inducing exercise, especially when it's well-meaning, benevolent sexism. You can actually use tactics like disarming to explain what the comment or the action, why it made you feel uncomfortable. And so by explaining it, you actually might just win yourself an ally. So it doesn't have to be an adversarial speaking up.
So can you explain that? Because we just talked about women being more aggressive. How do you disarm? Are you saying you humorize it? And then is that kind of like, what do you do?
You can potentially use humor as a tactic, but also making the other person aware that when they say something sexist, it actually hurts you. And especially if it's a benevolent sexism, it's not because the person is trying to be mean. In fact, the person is trying to be kinder to you. It's just that it's not working. So disarming the person, but still explaining what effect it has can be a way to go. Sometimes humor is an excellent strategy. The other big thing is that we have to create support networks. And when I say support networks, I don't just mean in the workplace. Yes, mentoring is important, but we also need a support network at home. It is the truth. There's no way getting around it that at the moment, working women also disproportionately bear the responsibility of household tasks and caring. That is how it is. And if this was not any clear before COVID, work from home has made it very, very clear. Women are actually at a greater risk of burnout. Working women who are working from home, taking care of family and children are at a greater risk of burnout. We cannot do it all alone, and we don't have to. We have to create support structure in both work and family domains, and that is a part of the process. So if there was one takeaway point, if it should be from this, don't try to do it all alone. Create support structure. And I want to go back to Indra Nui's example. Despite her mom's comment, her success as a migrant woman to head one of the largest companies in the world actually comes from the support structure, both in the family domain and the work domain. For example, her employer actually offered to give her 6-month paid leave to take care of her ailing father. She ended up taking only 3 months, and she's documented it in her autobiography. So as a woman, think about how you can build a support structure around you to achieve success. And increasingly, when there are non-traditional family arrangements, you also want to think about non-traditional sources of support. You also have to, if you have a partner, you have to enlist the partner to make sure there is support on the family front as well. I love the picture of chess because it forces us to think 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 steps ahead. At least let's think 2 moves ahead. So here's an example. Someone coming back from maternity leave might think that cutting hours might be the best option at that moment. But bear in mind that it can cost you opportunities for advancement in the longer term. So can you work with your manager to find an option that can help you on ramp so that you don't have to lose your career trajectory? And again, one of our respondents from our research projects talked about this. She was in mining, and when she came back from maternity leave, she was offered 2 options. She was offered an opportunity to work 4 days a week, so she could take a day off, but she was offered 20% extra pay if she could be retained full time, because it was in organization's interest to do that. And she said she chose to do 5 days a week because that extra 20% allowed her to hire a nanny to create that support structure at home, but also not hurt her career. So thinking 2 steps ahead about what effect is going to have on your career 5 years down the line helps. Now, when you're burnt out, you're going to latch at every opportunity of relief. But the key is to have that support structure, creating that support structure so you're not a stage where stepping down or taking time off is the only answer you have. And finally, if you're a man or a woman in a position of power, you have to use that power to help. I'm going to again give you an example from our own research. We conducted this, women in power can help the next generation in 2 ways. So on a mine site, if something happens, they can talk to the younger women and give them the support they need. They can also use the position power to call out injustice. They can, if there are any harassment or discrimination charges, they can pursue it through official channels. But women in power can also help create these support structures, and both men and women in power can do that. If you are ahead in your career and you can see 2 moves ahead, you can actually be a mentor to help these women to stay on that good quality career track and help. Why is this important? Because we see this leaky pipeline in many STEM-based fields. Women enter the field, but as they go along, we can't retain them. And if we can stop this leak at different stages, we can actually help women keep in those careers and help them advance in their careers. One of the things, Bianca, you talked about was that, what about competition? How do we compete and cooperate with other women? And it made me reflect. So when is there a competition among women? It's when we think that there is only one seat at the table.
Yes, yes.
You can change that, right?
It is. When I think of the psychology around this, it takes me back to a high school, to a schoolyard environment of being the desire to be the top female student. I don't know, top netball player, top prettiest girl. Even yearbooks will celebrate things like that. you know, we have a structure of doing that, that there is room for only one.
Mm-hmm.
And it does get very competitive early on. And I just wonder if you see that in the corporate landscape, in workplaces, and how we can disarm that.
So you see that sometimes, especially in highly male-dominated spaces, especially those women who came up in the 80s and even before, who fought it out, made a lot of sacrifices, sometimes gave up their family. They had to start adopting masculine characteristics. And as one of our respondents called them, they became men in a skirt. Because that's what they had to do to succeed. But that's changed. We don't have the same situation now. Maybe that was the only way to survive then, but now we can be different. If we can create these authentic dimensional role models for women, that is actually quite successful. There doesn't have to be just one token female in a top management team. In fact, we know, and you have seen Carol Kulik's research that talks about having 30% women actually enhances, and every extra woman you have actually has a stronger effect, a bigger trickle-down effect. And that is a multiplicative trickle-down effect. So if you're not just competing for one seat, if you compete for more seats, you are helping other women and you're actually advancing the cause of gender equity. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, that's really good. Can I just go back for any members that might be listening about how this they can use this information in their workplaces? Speaking up and speaking out is still confrontational. It's sometimes easier to not. Arguably today, more and more people are doing it. How do you embrace your power in that regard to feel, and how do you do it safely?
That is a really, really good question. And how do you do it safely? So one thing you have to, it goes back to creating that support structure and a network. And going back to the example from situations in mining or geosciences, which are really extreme situations, having that one woman at the senior level makes things enormously easier. And so we have that now, or even having a woman instructor on a field trip helps enormously. So creating that support structure can help you also speak out and speak up better, being aware of what opportunities there are and what rules there are, so that and the HR policies, so you can follow the right procedure, is important.
Now, last question from me. You spoke at the very beginning, as we unpacked sexism, the subtle nature that it can take on. At what point is sexism not a big deal? At what point do we need to say, you know, let's just park that? And should we at all?
That is such a cool question. And have I done that in the past? Yes. Have you seen Emily in Paris?
No, I'm looking for another good movie.
It's a show and it's very bingeable. And it's got lots of tropes and lots of stereotypes and all those kind of things. But it's got a really lovely episode about is it sexy or is it sexist? And part of it is also about the perspective. But there may be instances where you think if it's actually what's the intent and what's the impact. So think about the impact it's been creating. And if it is creating an impact for yourself or for others, a negative impact, then it's time to speak up. That's how I would go with it.
I love it. Excellent. Any other issues you want to raise? And Paula, do you have any questions?
No, that's been interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll stop sharing. And
thank you so much. Shruti, I wanted to thank you for your time. It's been really insightful, and hopefully people got some tips and strategies that they can apply within their workforces or their everyday life, or maybe just even expanded the way they think about sexism in the workplace in their daily lives, and the subtlety, the subtle nod that some of us, even myself, tend to give to sexism. Because I felt when I put this out there as a concept, even mentioning it to my mother, she was like, oh, do you want to go there really? It's midday on a Friday. And I get it, but it doesn't, I feel like we've unpacked it to another level, which has been very good. So thank you so much for your time.